Thank you very much for attending this important event, not because IAG is important, but because the evaluation and the topics are very important. And we are really honored and privileged to have the chair of CODI with us, Ottaviano Canuto, who needs no introduction. And we also have Manuela Ferro, the VP for OPCS, who needs no introduction. We don't have Caroline Hyder, the Senior Vice President and Head of Evaluation, here in the room, but she has recorded a video to welcome you and introduce the evaluation. So I should have introduced myself. I'm Auguste Kwame. I work in IAG as Director for the department where we prepared this evaluation. So without much ado, let me go to Caroline's video. And then after Caroline, we'll hear from Ottaviano. And then after Ottaviano, we'll hear from Manuela. And then we'll go to Jelko, who is the TTL for the evaluation. Jelko will have a 10-minute quick presentation. And then we'll move to the panel, which will be moderated by our own Shanta Devarajan, who is Senior Director in DEC, as you know, and also Acting Vice President for the World Bank Group. And then he will introduce the panel. So let's move to Caroline's welcoming video.
In 2013, the World Bank Group adopted the twin goals of ending extreme poverty and boosting shared prosperity. Boosting shared prosperity matters even more today. I see at least 3 reasons why. First, we have seen incredible gains in poverty reduction. That is a great thing. However, these gains have often gone hand in hand with increasing inequality, which undermines inclusive growth. The economic model of broadening growth with the help of labor-intensive industries is coming to an end in the wake of the fourth industrial revolution, AI, and robotization. This will deepen the challenges of tomorrow that require us to focus not only on the poor, but on preventing the bottom 40% from falling behind. Second, inequality, environmental pollution, and climate change make for a tragic mix. Under the 2030 Agenda, we, the global community, have promised generations to come a world that is clean, green, and resilient for all. This is an enormous challenge under the best of circumstances. In my view, it makes it even more urgent to rethink development models. Can traditional growth models provide for sustainable shared prosperity? Third, and closely linked to the former 2 reasons, conflict. Social discontent arising from steep inequality and uneven access to opportunities, combined with strains on natural resources, have caused conflicts in the past. In all likelihood, they continue to do so well into the future. Economic migration and forced displacement places stress on host communities wherever they are in the world and have destabilized societies. I believe these are some of the reasons why the World Bank Group adopted the twin goals, and in particular that of boosting shared prosperity. We undertook the evaluation knowing it was too early to see the results of this ambitious agenda. Instead, we wanted to understand whether the World Bank Group had put in place everything to succeed. We wanted to deliver insights into areas where changes are needed to ensure success in the medium and long term. And that is exactly what we've delivered. So what did we evaluate? We asked ourselves whether distributional effects of interventions had been understood and deliberately pursued, starting from analytical work through country strategies to operational work in monitoring systems. Our hypothesis was that if you don't aim for a positive outcome, you still might have impact, positive or negative, or miss opportunities to boost shared prosperity. The evaluation that my colleagues will present and the eminent panel will discuss today highlights many opportunities for the World Bank Group to strengthen its effectiveness in boosting shared prosperity. I am hopeful that the institutions will vigorously implement our recommendations to ensure success in the near future. With that, let me wish you an inspiring event and hopefully lasting effects on the World Bank Group's pursuit of this goal.
Do you have it?
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Uh, it's a pity that I have to run somewhere else because I would wish to watch this whole discussion afterwards. But anyway, it's going to be recorded and we'll have the chance to watch it later. But I couldn't miss the opportunity to come here and give my own appraisal. Uh, Definitely, uh, on my behalf and also on behalf of my colleagues, we wish to commend the IG once again on an excellent, timely, and highly relevant product and process. I mean it, the process as well, besides the product, in the course of the preparation of this major evaluation. The product, the evaluation itself, has provided the first and early glimpse into how and how effectively the bank group has been operationalizing the shared prosperity goal. As such, it provides us with a unique window into the early practice, its strengths and weaknesses, in the bank group's support for shared prosperity in its knowledge, strategies, and project level interventions. The recent board discussion has shown a broad appreciation and support for the evaluation findings and recommendations among the board members. The report's central message is that the bank has put in a lot of effort in scaling up knowledge work on shared prosperity, largely through the country diagnostics and the partnerships. Uh, but more work needs to be done to mainstream the goal in the country's strategies and projects across agencies, networks, and regions in order to achieve results. I take it as a guardedly optimistic message. It's optimistic because the bank group indeed needs to understand at the country level the complex development context and binding constraints to sustainable inclusive growth before it can zero in on those constraints with effective strategies and projects. At the same time, it is guarded because it warns us, among other things, about the need for the bank group to be much more articulated and precise in formulating theories of change that link strategic and project objectives with specific mechanisms, with outcomes and development results on the ground. And that's maybe the major challenge, is to make sure that we have an understanding analytically and in practical terms on those connections, on having theories of change. And in that regard, the report also offers rich and relevant recommendations that you will discuss, that I believe the bank management will follow up on carefully as it engages in the next stage of the implementation of the shared prosperity agenda. Finally, as I spoke in the beginning on the processes, I want to note the enhanced internal consultative process that this evaluation has pursued. On request from the board, the team has engaged in extensive briefings of board members in the interim stage of evaluation, giving board members a closer sense of the evaluation's preparation and some very preliminary findings, as well as, obviously, the opportunity for board members to share perspectives from their constituencies. I understand that a similar process. Oh, okay. I understand that a similar process has taken place vis-à-vis bank management. So I want to commend this enhanced engagement of the IG with the board and the management while safeguarding its independence as the cornerstone of its corporate mandate. Thank you very much indeed.
Very good. So now for the third introduction, which will be very brief. Let me start where Ottaviano left it. This is a very good example of how management, the board, and IG can really pull their different strengths and roles together to look at what is our second goal, but the sometimes forgotten goal, the shared prosperity goal. This is something in which, this evaluation is something in which we in OPCS have been thinking about how to revamp the work we are doing. Because the extreme poverty goal is well understood by staff. It's measured, it's can be aggregated, while the second one not so much. And in reading the evaluation, it surprised me that some staff don't actually understand how it's actually measured. So this is an area of work that is extremely important to us. It's very important for staff. We hope that staff will read the report. There's a lot of very useful advice, and it comes in early on in the process. At the end of the day, we established these two goals relatively recently. We don't have CPFs that have been evaluated in programs that have been evaluated that already incorporate these goals, so it's very timely. I am very much looking forward to the discussion, and I am looking forward to this more collaborative way of working with IEG. We think IEG is a great value added of the bank. We have perhaps the strongest independent evaluation group of all the MDBs, and making more use of the work they do require us to be also more involved and more engaged in pushing them to look at things that where we would like an arm's length assessment of the work that management is doing. And it's in that spirit that I'm here. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'll stay throughout the conversation and then offer some closing remarks. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Agist. It's a privilege to be here and to be able to present to you the results of the IEG evaluation on the shared prosperity goal. The work that has been going on over the past 16 months or so. And I would like at the outset to thank the large evaluation team that was engaged, as well as the IEG management for their exemplary support. I should mention from the outset that the evaluation takes the shared prosperity goal and its official definition as given, which is the growth of income of the bottom 40%. And it is this definition that is applied throughout the evaluation consistently, and asking the basic question, how actually has the World Bank Group and its agencies across the board been implementing this goal in its strategies, knowledge, and lending products? And so I'll touch upon three basic sets of questions in a very broad brush, high-level manner, given by the time constraint. First, what's the scope? Second, what are the findings? And third, what are the recommendations? So the objective of the evaluation is to evaluate how effectively has the World Bank Group and its agencies been implementing shared prosperity goals since its inception in the new World Bank Group strategy in October 2013, in its diagnostics, knowledge, strategies, and project-level interventions. To that end, we have looked at all of the World Bank knowledge and lending project-level interventions, so a period of about 2005 to 2016, with a particular focus on the period after the introduction of the goal, but also looking into the past for a glimpse of potential lessons that can be used for the future. All World Bank Group agencies are involved, and mixed methods are used in order to triangulate evidence from multiple sources of evidence and methods in order to increase the robustness and fidelity in the results. So what are the findings? Overall, I think it's fair to say that the World Bank Group has made concerted and significant effort to pursue shared prosperity agenda at country levels, regional and global fora. However, much more needs to be done in order to translate those efforts into tangible results on the ground and development outcomes. Knowledge has been spearheading the World Bank interventions, especially through the SCD CPF process, the systematic country diagnostics, which has really elevated the whole agenda in a number of ways, including the bringing forward new data and new analysis. The most common pathways that we have found in terms of how the World Bank Group is pursuing shared prosperity are two: building assets of the bottom 40% households, human capital assets, physical infrastructure, and so on. Financial capital, access to financial capital. But also the importance of policies and institutions are highlighted in all of the findings. And finally, the World Bank Group has been clearly exercising strong convening power in order to put this agenda forward and to really play a global and regional country level public good role, even when that is not necessarily always on the top of the agenda in local environments. However, there are challenges in implementation. And first of all, the data are a big problem. Distributional data are a big problem. I'll touch on that. Timeliness, frequency. Second, the knowledge products outside the SCD CPF cycle, which is a kind of a 5-year cycle, seem to not actually include a strong focus on shared prosperity. And this is potentially a problem because actually we do knowledge products every year and every month and not just every 5 years in SCD contexts. So it is important that to keep focus on that. And finally, we do find at strategy levels and country project levels, one of the central findings is that theory of change that links the objectives of World Bank interventions is lacking in clarity in articulation. And that potentially is a problem for achieving the results. Few projects have actually clear theory of change and disaggregated indicators in order to achieve those results. And in addition, we also find that, for example, the geographic footprint of the World Bank projects, while generally correlating with the population at about 40%, in a number of countries where perhaps that's needed the most, the low-income countries, that is not clear. And with new geospatial data, perhaps the bank can do more in these geospatial interventions. And finally, staff understanding and skills may need strengthening to effectively pursue this agenda in the future. So using a staff survey, we have actually tried to gauge the staff understanding and the skills in order to implement effectively shared prosperity. And what we have found is that that staff has basically pursued shared prosperity primarily through knowledge type interventions, through policy dialogue with clients in the context of the SCD, in the context of CPF, in the context of the DPF interventions, but also other knowledge products, systematic country diagnostics, and so on and so forth, and less so through project interventions. I mentioned that the World Bank Group has been pursuing its shared prosperity agenda through the convening power. At the global level, through close coordination with the United Nations, the World Bank's well-known role in the SDG agenda, especially the data behind the SDG goal number 1 on poverty and number 10 on inequality, as well as the biannual flagship report on poverty and shared prosperity, which is becoming the authoritative global reference with latest and comparable data on poverty and shared prosperity that was launched in 2016. But perhaps more importantly, at the country level, in all of our field visits, we have seen strong role that the World Bank has been playing in the policy dialogue, elevating the shared prosperity agenda, and clearly having success in countries like Colombia, Haiti, Indonesia, and so on and so forth. However, data constraints are a big problem. Even in SCDs that are of high quality and where analysis is cutting edge, we find that some of those SCDs are actually made in a very low environment quality of the data. 81 developing countries out of 185 actually have the data underpinnings to calculate the shared prosperity goal. However, half of the developing world, 74 countries, do not have those data. So therefore, that is a major problem, especially in low-income countries where, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, 35 out of 48 countries do not have this basic information that allows it to credibly calculate information about the shared prosperity. Now, when we look at the country partnership frameworks, which is essentially the main country strategic framework for bank operations at the country level, and we look at the objectives of those frameworks. we see actually only 7% of them would actually pass a bar of what we would call a quality theory of change, scored 2 and 3. And we have used this, we have made this evaluation based on a standard a paradigm of quality theory of change called CMO, context, mechanism, and outcomes, that actually is trying to measure specifically how the interventions link objectives within specific context with concrete interventions resulting in specific development outcomes. When we look at the projects, we see that few projects actually refer to shared prosperity. Only 36% of World Bank projects refer to shared prosperity in a semblance of theory of change. And even fewer include clear theory of change that actually links those interventions to the bottom 40%. And the percentages are lower in the case of the IFC. Quality of theory of change in bank projects is relatively low across regions, so there is no clear differential pattern there. This is a systemic issue across the bank. And also, quality of theory of change in projects is low across instruments, development policy lending, as well as the investment projects. The few P4R projects that actually do have quality theory of change, the situation is a little different, but I wouldn't put too much credence to these data because the sample is so small. What did we find about the IFC projects? Well, first of all, only 15% of IFC projects refer to shared prosperity, and of those, only half actually mention it without specifying how they would actually contribute. And the other half attempted to articulate that link, but would not necessarily pass the bar of the quality theory change that I mentioned. Non-directly target for the bottom 40%. When we look at actually in which areas the IFC has been pursuing shared prosperity, perhaps not surprisingly, it is in the area of financial markets, access to markets, supporting micro and small enterprises, and so on and so forth, largely in the mass manufacturing, agriculture, and services business line of the IFC, and also through the jobs interventions related to jobs and affordability. But again, the link with bottom 40% is not clear. Recently, however, IFC has indeed been scaling up significantly its efforts to better measure the development impact of its projects. What did we find about MIGA? Well, MIGA is working essentially in close concert with the IFC. And recently it's been significantly scaling up its engagement and guarantees, especially in the IDA and FCV countries, which is important for shared prosperity and poverty reduction. And most of the IFC and MIGA joint projects actually tend to be focused on infrastructure, which indeed is an important public good that links to the shared prosperity agenda. Moving on to the staff perceptions and opinions and understandings reflected in the staff survey, we note that basically about a third of the staff are not familiar fully with the official definition of the goal, and that the situation varies somewhat between the IBRD, where it's higher, to IFC, where it is lower. And this situation varies across global practices, perhaps in a predictable way, where the poverty and MFM and DEC and social practices tend to have higher percentages compared to other sectoral practices. Also, I would like to reiterate the point about the geospatial footprint of the World Bank projects. This is something that we've analyzed in depth, and we find basically that now there is data to monitor that footprint better and to link the bank interventions with the spatial distribution of the 140%. So, in conclusion, we have come up with 5 broad recommendations that mirror these findings. They're deliberately broad and directional in order to give the World Bank management scope and room to actually implement them effectively. First, distributional data need improvement. So the World Bank Group and the IFC should really work and step up the game to provide sufficient funding for analytical products on an ongoing basis that are related to shared prosperity, and also work closely with clients to ensure quality, timeliness, and frequency of institutional data, of distributional data. World Bank Group management should also ensure that country strategies as well as project-level interventions in relevant contexts include very clear and credible theories of change that explains how those interventions are actually going to deliver results. And in addition, it is important also those clear results frameworks to be linked to measurable and relevant indicators that measure the contributions of these interventions to the shared prosperity. Finally, World Bank Group should monitor the extent to which the geographic distribution of project interventions and associated beneficiaries and that of the spatial distribution of the bottom 40% are congruent. That is not always the case, and we find that that is not always the case in countries that need it most. And in conclusion, the final recommendation is that the World Bank Group management should ensure that its operational staff understand the shared prosperity goal and have the necessary skills that are needed to effectively pursue this agenda in the future. In closing, the World Bank Group agencies have made concerted and significant effort to pursue shared prosperity agenda at the global and country levels, but much more needs to be done in order to translate those efforts in tangible development results and outcomes on the ground. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Jaco, for a very nice and succinct overview of the report. So we now have some time for a panel discussion as well as questions from the audience. So let's just jump right into it. My first question is to Carol, as the senior director for the Poverty GP, and if you listen to what Caroline said, what Auguste said, what Jaco said as well, we take this indicator, we take this goal of shared prosperity, which nobody can argue with. We use an indicator that says, and growth in the incomes of the bottom 40%, right? Notice it says nothing about the growth of the top 60%, right? But somehow we immediately assume that it's a indicator of distribution. You can see how if the top 60% grows faster than the bottom 40%, distribution gets worse, but doesn't violate our goal, right? We're still consistent. So, and the whole report, I mean, the report is a faithful attempt at looking at to the extent to which the bank has taken distribution seriously. And that's appropriate, but then the question that I have for Carol is, then is it time to go beyond this mythical growth of the bottom 40% as the indicator of what we really mean by shared prosperity?
Thank you, Shanta. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this discussion. Maybe 4 points on that. A couple of them sort of to set the context, I think, and to pick up some of what was said, and then getting a little bit to your issue on inequality. Let's go back to the discussion that we had when we actually decided that shared prosperity was the goal that we wanted to adopt. And at that point, we did actually consider whether inequality was the goal that we wanted to adopt. And there was a lot of back and forth, and we concluded that no, shared prosperity was something that we thought was more aligned with the institutional mandate, but more importantly, resonated more with the countries that we were trying to engage with, which were primarily middle-income countries for whom the extreme poverty goal, in a way, had become somewhat irrelevant. And we thought that sort of squarely saying you need to worry about those that are at the bottom of the distribution, and I agree with you, whether that's 40 or 35 or 45, it's a bit arbitrary, that was something that would resonate, because in a way, it is really about inclusive growth. I mean, we can call it shared prosperity, but that's what this sort of reflects. And I think what we've seen over the last 3 years is that actually this, there is success, in the sense that this does resonate actually with client countries. When we talk about the inclusive growth agenda and sort of thinking about how the bottom of the distribution benefits from whatever is happening more broadly. So in that sense, I think we first succeeded, but also because there's a brand that is sticking, there's a little bit of a risk in changing gears. I'm going to get to your point, because I think what we should do is expand, not change. Similarly, there's clear that there's homework to be done within the institution, because I think one of the important findings of the of the report is that even though awareness of this has increased and people are trying to use this to inform the work that they are doing and the policy dialogue, there's still, frankly, a scarily large part of the institution that doesn't really know what this is. I suspect some of that it's about the name and the indicator, and I think if you ask people, what is inclusive growth, how does what you do relate to that, you would get higher rates. But the reality is we do have a goal with an indicator, and we need to make sure that people know about it. So again, when I put those two together, my sense is we've been successful, we are moving in the right direction, but there's work to do, so we need to sort of remain focused on this rather than, now kind of change gears. Having said that, in practice, I actually think we are doing a little bit of that, not changing gears, but sort of adding to the conversation. We know from the work we've done on shared prosperity that actually when countries manage to have inclusive growth, in many cases that actually translates into lower inequality. So even if we are not sort of articulating that clearly, that is in reality what's happening. Of those 83 countries that Jelko was referring to, I think, let me make sure I give you the right numbers, in about 60, over the last 5 years or the period for which we have data, we've seen that actually shared prosperity was positive. And in 49 out of those, so the large majority, the bottom 40 grew faster than the top 60. So in reality, by promoting and by succeeding in having inclusive growth, these countries were de facto, decreasing inequality, even if that's not sort of how we were framing it. But more importantly, I think because we do realize that in the recent sort of past, inequality has come more to the forefront of some of our conversations with clients, maybe middle income, high income sort of stakeholders more so than low income stakeholders. But it is there and it is an issue. We've increasingly complemented our work on poverty and shared prosperity with a discussion on how those two goals relate to inequality. And we've done that in two ways. One, by saying, look, inequality has intrinsic value. People care about this, and therefore we should make it part of the conversation. And I think nobody here would probably question that. But then also saying, look, inequality, or rather reducing inequality, is actually critical to our succeeding in reducing poverty and promoting shared prosperity. And that was actually the focus of the first Poverty and Shared Prosperity report that Jelko alluded to. In fact, the title of that report was Taking on Inequality, and what we argued was that unless countries did that, in addition to promoting growth, we would be unlikely to meet the goal of poverty reduction, or just to see inclusive growth happening more broadly. And we'll be launching, this report shortly, that looks at this issue on a more dynamic type of framework by asking about intergenerational economic mobility and whether poverty is transmitted from parents to kids. And again, the idea that inequality, in this case, inequality of opportunity, is critical to promote economic mobility will be, part of that discussion. And, then we are obviously dealing with the issue of inequality at the country level in SCDs and other country work. So, to conclude, I don't think we should be switching gears, but I think we are already recognizing that inequality is an important part of the conversation. And we are trying to sort of build the case and have a narrative and the evidence to support it around how inequality relates to the two institutional goals and what are some of the things that we and the clients that we work with can do about it.
Okay. Thanks very much, Carol. Let me now turn to Ted Hsu, the chief economist of IFC. Ted, as you heard and from the report, IFC does slightly less well than the IBRD in terms of both the focus on shared prosperity as well as articulating the theory of change. Is there something intrinsic in IFC that led to this, or is it just a matter of time before we catch up? In particular, just to you don't need reminding, but maybe some people here do. IFC does have its own version of twin goals, which is that or two constraints. What do you call it? The double bottom line? Yeah. Which is that there has to be a profit alongside the inclusive growth or whatever it is that your development impact, that's right, that you're trying to do. Does that actually then detract from achieving shared prosperity?
Thank you, Shanta. First of all, let me say this, IFC management broadly agree with the key findings of the report, which is an excellent piece of work. I would say that the nature of private sector activities at IFC does not, inherently make it more difficult to achieve the shared prosperity goal. And looking back, when you look at IFC's operation, we just celebrated 60 years of history, we have always emphasized shared prosperity aspect as part of our mission. So you look back even before the twin goals were introduced, we were talking for a long time about inclusive business, about affordability, about bottom of the pyramid, about the underserved segments of the population. So all these languages, I think it's wholly consistent with the very well articulated goal of the shared prosperity. I think it's 2014, right, when it was introduced. 2013. So now with that, I will step back and say, okay, why is it then the findings of staff awareness, the ability to articulate theory of change, and the ability to demonstrate impact quantitatively is lagging behind, let's say, the World Bank? I would say there are several reasons. One reason is that staff at the operational level, they think they understand it. Right? They don't think that this considerational element is missing in their operations. However, from the communication perspective, it is more difficult. And over time, IFC has gone ups and downs through several cycles of emphasizing or de-emphasizing this. And right now, I would say we are definitely on an upcycle, in a sense that the new strategies being articulated, IFC 3.0, and the associated goals of maximizing finance for development, the goal of take advantage of the private sector window, and most importantly, I would like to emphasize that, and as the report recognizes, that we have launched a new measurement system called AIM. It's an anticipated impact measurement and monitoring system, which is squarely aimed at trying to quantify and articulate the development impact of IFC interventions, whether it's investments or advisory services, and so on and so forth. But let me conclude my comment by saying that there are still a lot of challenges of achieving our goal, and we're trying to find a lot of solutions. Solution number one is that we're looking forward to increase collaboration with the World Bank, particularly Carol's group, but also with the joint practices in terms of understanding and sharing of the knowledge, as well as data. And we are also developing internally analytical capabilities. Without going into details, I would say that we have significantly added a new capacity of economists and analysts to work in this area and elevating the economics function to the vice presidency level. And those, I would say that are very encouraging developments.
Thank you, Ted. Thanks very much. Okay, now let me turn to Auguste, who directed this this report, and let me pick up on the point that Jelko also mentioned in his presentation, which is you took the shared prosperity goal and the indicator as given and measured or monitored how the bank staff or the bank group has adapted to it. But in hindsight, would you have thought that it might be good also to ask whether bank staff are actually questioning the goal itself or pushing us to stretch the goal further? Because if you really think about it, you're really looking at to what extent has the bank actually contributed to the overall goal of shared prosperity, almost, regardless of whether we got the indicator precisely right or wrong. Would you have liked to look at that question? Because as you can tell from the first two commenters, there is it's a lot richer agenda than the narrow indicator.
Thank you, Shanta. I'm aware that there was a lot of discussion before the goal was adopted, especially the second goal. And what we decided to evaluate is not whether the bank has or not adopted the right goal. What we wanted to evaluate is whether the bank is implementing the goal it decided to adopt. Having said that, we did ask staff the question as to whether they understand the goal as specified by the bank. And we found that only 63% of staff actually understand what the goal means. So whether they agree with the goal or not, I think staff need to have a good understanding of the goal if they're going to implement it successfully. We also asked whether the goal is sufficient to achieve development impact. Now, what we found in the evaluation, as Shelko said, whether the goal is good or not, it's not enough to just articulate it, and it's not enough to just mainstream it. You need to do it right. So you need to do the right thing, but you also need to do it right. What does it mean to do it right? It means you need to have a clearly articulated theory of change to explain how you're going to use your project activities to pursue the goal that you have decided to adopt. It means that you need to have a good result framework. You need to have good data to monitor. You need to know where the bottom 40 are so that you can align, to the extent possible, your project with where they live. What that is, it means also that you need to be able to have a conversation with your client, with countries, and to have that conversation, you need to have data. You can't just go and say, okay, we're doing shared prosperity, but how? So you need to have data. You need to have enough data. You can't have just one household survey per country. You need to have at least two to measure the growth. You need to have a number of things as well, including investing in analytical work internally. Whether we agree with the goal or not, staff need to be able to measure it. They need to have the skills to incorporate it in their project or their activities. Now, I know I have not fully answered your question as to whether we should have evaluated staff's agreement with the goal or not, but I would, if I were sitting in your chair, I would have asked you that question because you are the chief economist. You were responsible for advising the bank on adopting the goal. So, institutional continuity. But thanks.
Okay. That's fair. It's a fair if cheap shot. But as I said, I have a follow-up. Actually, it may be a question for Jekko, but this business of the theory of change. I mean, as you said, a lot of the projects, a lot of the interventions don't articulate a theory of change of how this intervention then could lead to shared prosperity. Now, is the problem that they didn't articulate a theory of change of how this intervention leads to shared prosperity, or they didn't articulate a theory of change of how it leads to anything? I mean, are we just very bad at articulating a theory of change? Or were they actually articulating a theory of change that led to something else?
Well, let me try and answer, and then Jelko can add if needed. What the team did was not to look at theory of change in any project. They looked at projects that said they're going to pursue shared prosperity. And then within those projects, they looked at whether the project had a good theory of change to explain how they're going to achieve shared prosperity. And they didn't just look at whether the theory of change exists. They looked at the quality of the theory of change as well, because you can have a theory of change, but it may not be of good quality. And then they looked at whether the theory of change was complemented by a result framework and availability of data to actually measure what, at the end of the day, what they will have achieved. So they didn't look at any theory of change. They looked at theory of change within project that wanted to pursue shared prosperity. Jelko, you want to add anything? Okay.
Yes. Thank you. Maybe just a word on that. I mean, not necessarily on sort of what the projects did, but I think that some of what gets on the way of our being able to articulate a meaningful theory of change? Well, two things. One is, do we have the framework, right? And we had a lot of discussions about whether we do or we don't, and should we have one framework or should people come up with their own framework? And and I think we've made some progress on coming up with some kind of organizing frameworks that help people think about where in that sort of collection of levers does your project come in, and all of that. What I think we still have a lot of work to do is on the, obviously on the documentation and sort of the data, but more importantly, I think it's on the policy side. Do we actually have a good understanding for what are the policies that matter for shared prosperity? And I think the answer to that is mixed. I think we have a good understanding for how fiscal policy, transfers, et cetera, matter for poverty, but also for shared prosperity, right, in a lot of countries. I think our understanding of how sort of labor markets, factor markets, et cetera, work or done for shared prosperity is a lot more mixed. And I think that does get on the way of people being able to say, this is how things will work. So I think there's an important agenda there, and hopefully, we will see some progress on that. So, to me, that was sort of a glass half full, half empty kind of finding, right? It didn't sort of surprise me.
No, that's exactly right. My sense is that we're not very good at articulating the theory of change to achieve anything, whatever the goal is. If they had a good theory of change of how this energy project was going to generate sustainable economic growth, I would have been quite happy, and which, by the way, might actually have benefited the 40% too. But let me push. I come back to Carol. I think you're right about extending rather than replacing goals. But let me think about, I just want to give you two examples where I think the goal actually could have been misleading. One is actually in the Middle East. In the 10 years before the Arab Spring, the per capita incomes of the bottom 40% grew faster than the average GDP, right? In the countries where there was a revolution. So there still were revolutions. And by the way, inequality also was going down in these countries. Now, the story there is that it was the middle 40%, the 40th to the 80th percentile, that actually was squeezed so much that they began to look like the bottom 40%, which is why inequality went down. You had a more equal 80%, bottom 80%. So that would have been a case where if we looked at, we didn't have the goals then, but had we done the goals, said, oh yeah, Tunisia is doing just fine. In fact, we did say that. Right? We had a conference in October 2010 that said Tunisia a model country. But, no, a month later. The other, coming back to theory of change, also we may get things wrong. And I'm thinking of Brazil's big expansion into agribusiness, the Cerrado program there. Now, if I looked at that and listening to Jeko as well, you might have said, well, that's agribusiness. They're going to throw all these small farmers out of business, and some big firms are going to come in, and that's not helping shared prosperity. But on the contrary, that actually did a lot for shared prosperity. Many of these farmers gave up being farmers, which is probably and moved somewhere else. They had the Bolsa Familiar and everything else. So had we done a true general equilibrium analysis, as you said, the framework was not just look at the fact that big bad multinationals are going to come in and take over these farms, but rather that this was a way of releasing some of these people so that they can educate their children better and they can move to the cities. We would have gotten it wrong. So in both of those cases, do we need to really question our current analysis rather than simply adding on analysis? I really want to come back to this. Are we asking our staff asking the questions rather than taking everything as given?
Thanks. We've talked recently about the Middle East issue, and I think I'm going to say what we sort of said in that conversation. That is, many times looking at income is not enough. And that applies to poverty, to shared prosperity, or to or inequality for that matter, in income, right? And I think the Middle East illustrates that very clearly. And in fact, the work that I was referring to earlier on economic mobility and intergenerational economic mobility very clearly shows that in the Middle East, at the same time that we had shared prosperity and income growth, mobility was very low. And you had a situation where you were educating the population pretty rapidly. So you had a lot of educated youth with very few prospects of actually doing better than their parents, and in fact, probably prospects of doing worse than their parents. And I think that's what's at the sort of core of some of what we saw, right? So in that sense, yes, I mean, should we always sort of, constrain ourselves to a single dimension of welfare in any context and ignore sort of political economy issues, the dynamism of the economy and how some of those benefits are being distributed, et cetera? No, I mean, I don't think we've ever done that. And I don't think having goals sort of, it shouldn't translate into that. That's not how I interpret it. I mean, I think goals sort of focus your attention, but we shouldn't interpret them myopically. I think you need to sort of put them in a context. I know nothing about the Brazil stuff, and I really hope we didn't say that this was bad for shared prosperity. Because I agree with you, and I think that is, in a way, what we are lacking, is that sort of broader understanding of what are the interconnections in an economy and what happens to those at the bottom when you push on different sectors. And I think that's really where we have to invest. And if we had done that, I'm assuming we would have got to the right answer in this case. So, I'm agreeing with you, but I don't think that, that's sort of invalid in many ways.
Yeah, that's right. Ted, just one follow-up to you, and then I want to go to the audience for questions. Your aim, it's very nice to be able to identify the development impact as well as the profit of an intervention. But my question is then, given that we have a shared prosperity goal, what's the trade-off? How much shared prosperity are you willing to sacrifice for one more unit of profit? Or conversely, how much of a loss are you willing to take for one more unit of shared prosperity? What's the shape of that indifference curve?
Thank you, Shanta. That's a very difficult question to answer. But more seriously, also associated with your earlier question about how much can IFC afford to addressing the bottom 40% share prosperity, given that we had to be self-sustaining, we are not guaranteed by our shareholders, and we have double bottom line. I think the quick answer is that we need to have a shift of attention, a shift of the focus. So previously, we probably mostly paying attention to our projects, or our advisory work. But now, I think with the 3.0, we're shifting our attention to markets. And we are articulating the way that how we holistically looking at markets. So traditionally, as economists, you will say, okay, well, let's address where market fails, and then how do we address those market failures. But now we are also trying to be very, very specific to say that not only we wanted to understand the competitiveness of the market, which traditionally always been the attention of where a market fails, but also addressing the inclusiveness aspect, resiliency aspect, and sustainability aspect, and how this market is integrating with the global economy. So the integration aspect. So all these are now very specific measurements as being imposed within the aim. And then to address your question of where is the indifference curve, and do we have to face a trade-off between the big development impact and very small profit, or huge profit but minimal development impact? I think there are two ways. One is through the portfolio approach, which is to say holistically how much IFC is contributing to the country or to the region's well-being. And by the way, as our management, one of our management comment back to the report is that we not only need to be looking at the income aspect of the bottom 40%, but we also need to look at other measures of well-being. So all these we try to be incorporated in this portfolio approach. But then also at the same time, to answer your question, Shanta, I don't think IFC will ever have the majority of our projects in the so-called inclusive business, which is directly serving the bottom 40% or the bottom of the pyramid. So what should we do? Well, what we should do is exactly as Carol was saying earlier, that to really articulate the transmission channels. So for example, let me give you one example. In the Philippines, for the first time ever, we have been developing a methodology that be able to articulate the linkages between the energy sector intervention and the informality of the country. So you said, well, it's two separate things. How do you understand that? Well, we articulate the channels of energy cost, development of the agribusiness, development of the transportation sector, the manufacturing sector, and then with that, relative attractiveness of formal jobs will increase. So then the informality, which is a big issue for the country, is being articulated our impact.
All right, thanks very much. So now it's time to turn to you to ask us questions. So is there a mic? Oh, you use this. Okay.
Yeah. So maybe we can take 3 questions. So
Please raise your hand.
Thank you. Again, congratulations on the report. And it's not very surprising to me. Incidentally, introducing myself, I'm Kantan Shankar. I'm in the Fragility, Conflict and Violence Unit. My question is with regards to this whole issue related to fragile mix, and it comes back to what Shanta also was referring to. I mean, one of the jokes when I was living in Beirut was that there are more billionaires in Lebanon than there are Canada. So this whole issue related to the disparity in wealth and the whole issues related to shared prosperity issue, one of the biggest drivers of conflict, of fragility, is this inequality. So my question to you is, as part of your research work, and you looked at, I mean, I saw some kind of, but I don't know if you looked at any fragile mix, and was there any correlation between how you looked at this issues related to shared prosperity and potential conflict drivers? Thanks.
Let's take a few more. Oh no, yeah, I have a question. So, actually, yeah. So let me just add my question to Jaco. Actually, you use this idea, this framework of looking at assets, the extent to which the bank is helping the bottom 40% accumulate assets as a way of, again, coming back to the indicator, boosting their incomes. But there are 2 parts to an asset, right? One is the stock of the asset, and the other is the returns you earn from that asset. And how good are we at ensuring that those assets that we help people build are actually going to generate returns, especially when we're now in a world where even human capital assets might not generate the returns that we think they will, and certainly physical capital assets. I mean, you think about all the energy-intensive industries that IFC is invested in, which may not generate the returns. So, yeah, Jacob.
Thank you very much for that good question about inequality and fragility. I should just say from the outset that we haven't analyzed that specific question, which is very important, but there is obviously a literature on that actually shows that there is some evidence actually that these large movements in inequality do correlate with the social pressures that can actually escalate in large fragility and conflict situations. We have at some of the fragile countries, if you like, or fragile situations in the context of the country case studies, but again, specifically and through the lens of whether actually the World Bank's interventions, are in that particular environment, well designed and deliver results. So that's really the lens. I should also report one interesting finding from the staff survey that hasn't found its way into the high-level findings, and that is basically that when we asked staff, what do you think if the bottom 40% gold is to be modified? What do you think how it should be modified? And this was actually a question to kind of gauge a little bit of a staff sense. And actually, interestingly, the large share of the staff did report that inequality dimension should be brought in.
The return on assets.
So on the question of the return on assets, yes. I mean, basically the intellectual or conceptual framework that we have actually used, again, for lack of time, we didn't have time to go through it, is actually the asset-based framework. That it's really kind of this kind of general equilibrium framework that combines the macro and the macro, and basically says that it's the assets, it's the intensity of assets, and the prices of assets, and the institutions are actually are the mechanisms through which the macro shocks are transmitted at a household level to the incomes of the bottom 40%, and in fact, it provides a menu of different pathways through which economic activity and various shocks are translating themselves to the well-being of the bottom 40%. What we have found is that, as I mentioned, from the multitude of these different pathways and the channels, it's really those two that seem to be most critical, and they are reported both in the staff surveys, but also they're coming out clearly in the country case studies and the other analysis of the project documents that we have looked at.
But what about the returns to the asset? How will we?
Maybe I'll take a crack, because the team actually, I like the framework that Jelko mentioned, which is the asset-based framework. And what I learned from it, and it's a framework that IEG kind of put together based on World Bank owns analytical work. So we didn't invent it. We just derived it from what the World Bank says about what is needed to achieve shared prosperity, so the drivers of shared prosperity. So I thought there were five kind of drivers or pathways, one being the asset itself. But the other four, as I understood them, actually are correlated with the return and how people can get a higher return from their asset. So they are, quality of institutions. If you don't have good institutions and you have good assets, you may not have a good return on your asset. They're about the quality of macroeconomic policies. Similarly, bad macro policies will probably prevent you from getting good returns on your asset, whether you're rich or poor. Functioning markets, good functioning markets, they also would allow you to get a good return, assuming the market is well regulated, of course. They'll allow you to get a good return from your asset if you're poor. And then there are distribution, private and public redistribution. So, this is not that highly correlated to return, but it can boost your own accumulated assets. So, don't know whether this.
Malati, they have one more question. Yeah, come
on. It's not a question really. I was on Jelko's team and it was quite a journey, but I am someone who questioned this shared prosperity goal, because to me it's rather vague and narrow at the same time. And several, including my director, mentioned something about how you should design project activities to address the bottom 40%. And we showed a bullet there saying how much IFC focuses. The IFC should, what I'm saying is that IFC should not be directly targeting the bottom 40 in their objectives. Because as you said, there's the bottom line and there's sustainability, and I think there are trade-offs. My other comment is some of you addressed it when I was looking at agriculture. I did the agriculture background paper, and I went to the GP. They said, we didn't suddenly wake up and say, oh my goodness, we have to address shared prosperity. This is what we did. And in countries like Malawi, where 60, 70% maybe below the poverty line, it doesn't matter to us. We are not restricting ourselves to the bottom 40. If we build a road or help the middle, medium-sized industries that help the 50 or 60 or 70, that's what we've been doing. So I for one, challenge this definition, and I say that each and every project should not be having the bottom 40 as the objective. I don't know whether the panel can comment on it, and I think Željko and I discussed this at length in the last 18 months.
Maybe a couple of words on that. So maybe let me go back to why, and I wasn't part of those discussions, so don't kill the you were, so don't kill the messenger. But my understanding of why we decided to actually have something like shared prosperity rather than say something like inequality was the following. And let me just give you a very simple example. Imagine two countries, one country where the bottom 40 is growing at 10%, but the top 40 is growing at 12%. So inequality is increasing, okay? And then imagine another country where the bottom 40 is growing at 2% and the top 40 is growing at 1%. So inequality is declining. If you care about inequality exclusively, right, you would think that country 2, it's a better, has a better sort of development and growth, trajectory than country 1. But I think a lot of us would feel that from the perspective of those at the bottom of the distribution, probably country 1 is doing something right. So that was, in a way, part of the consideration for why, we wanted to remain focused on the bottom of the distribution, even though we understood that inequality was important. So I've never sort of looked at this as, okay, you only talk about that one thing or you talk about the other. These things are interrelated. But I think you are sending a message that ultimately it is about the bottom of the distribution and what's happening there. And then these are all, inequality and other issues are important considerations because people care about them and because they influence the policy environment. So we should obviously not ignore those. I'm not really sure, if you don't want projects to be focusing on the bottom of the distribution, I'm not really sure what you would want projects to be focusing on. So I'm not sure I understood what you're saying. Each project. Shouldn't
be mandatory for each project to focus on the bottom.
You may want to say something about that. If you ask me on the World Bank side, I think if you're not able to articulate how what you are doing will ultimately benefit people at the bottom of the distribution, they don't have to be direct beneficiaries. But if you're not able to articulate how that would happen, I'm not really sure. And that can be a very indirect issue. I mean, you could be sort of playing out there on the policy environment, but you still have to have some sense for where this is going ultimately and how is it going to affect inclusive growth. So, I mean, it may not be part of your results framework, but I think there has to be a narrative around that. I just wanted to say a word on the top income issue and sort of inequality. Because I very much agree with you that in many places that is a source of social tension. And I think we acknowledge that in the work that we do in Fragile Mix and in other places, frankly. We face a really strong limitation, though. That is, we really don't know. We have no idea what's happening with top incomes, and we have no idea what's happening with wealth. So a lot of it is very speculative, and we would love to have actually more information because I think it would be good to document it. It would be good to sort of surface those issues in the context of the policy dialogue, and frankly, it would be important for our advice on fiscal policy and some of the things that countries could do to actually use fiscal policy much more proactively to promote inclusive growth. But it's a huge limitation. Oh, sorry, yes.
Well, thank you. Let me add quickly to questions and comments. First, IFC's projects not required to have a shared prosperity as a part of the goal. So our slogan is creating markets and creating opportunities. So our investment staff look at a country and where are the opportunities for the private sector development, and quite often they find that it has impact on shared prosperity. and that's the way it goes. But however, it does not mean that we do not actively promote shared prosperity as a goal. We do. So let me give you a very concrete example. In our current planet finance activities, we are trying to articulate for the staff what is the rationale for us to provide subsidies for those private sector activities. And there are three, actually. Right? So number one is externality. Number two is de-risking, the need for de-risking risky projects. Number three here is affordability. So affordability is clearly, I would say, a shared prosperity objective. And we are educating our staff and saying that if you see opportunities to increase affordability, we're willing to give you subsidies. So you know, I would say that that is the approach we're taking. And then on the potential conflict between the two goals, I would say let's go back to Albert Hirschman, right? So he famously used the tunnel effect as an example to show that a lot of cases we should put growth first and inequality or the shared prosperity later. And he said that that should work. And Deng Xiaoping famously said that let some people get rich first. And the 40 years of Chinese experience show that it worked, because poverty goes down and then inequality rises and then inequality is reducing. Because when the country is rich, now China is putting tons of effort in terms of reducing poverty and shared prosperity. It has elevated to the national goal, but not until recently. So I think those are the areas that probably needs further economic research. Shanta, I seek your opinion on this.
We'll discuss that later. No, I thought you wanted to say one more thing.
Yeah, but
and then I'll turn to Manuel.
okay, great. Yeah. So I Ted, I know you didn't solicit my view on this point, but I'm tempted to say something about it. Actually, when we started the evaluation, the team asked the question whether, you know, inequality is necessary for growth, and you know, we lean toward saying no. I mean, you know, you can't say let's ignore inequality, let's grow the economy and then we'll redistribute, because you can plant the seeds for instability, as Kantan, you know, reminded us. You know, if you're growing in an environment of high inequality, your growth may not be sustainable. It can be disrupted by things. I mean, countries have different political systems. Some countries may be able to control that kind of risk because their political system allows them to do so. But if you have a political system that doesn't give you a lot of control, like you know, in the Arab Spring, people can just rise overnight, and you may try to control them, but you know, social media will allow them to disrupt. So I don't think inequality can be allowed to persist just for the sake of pursuing growth. Having said that, you know, there has to be some level of inequality in any society, and I think the goal is not to say that there have to be zero inequality. That's why there is no target for this goal. There is an indicator, but there is no target. I wanted to say that, you know, we didn't have a chance to really talk much about it, but this goal, the way we framed it in the evaluation, is that it has given the bank the opportunity to actually have conversation on shared prosperity with client countries in a way that is beneficial for them, not necessarily through projects, but through analytical work. So I think it would be good to take seriously the recommendation to invest resources in analytical work beyond the SCDs, because the SCDs are kind of aspirational. They're a bit more, they cross between analytical work and advocacy, but the real analytical work, like the CEM and other type of analytical work, are being defunded. And it's important to recognize that perhaps the bank is kind of undermining its own ability to pursue shared prosperity in the future in a credible fashion if there is no reversal of this trend of defunding real analytical work. And staff actually are asking, you know, when I work on a project in the country, what are the drivers of shared prosperity? I don't know, and people don't know. So there needs to be some investment in that. The bank has also kind of sent a signal that it wants to be the global leader on shared prosperity, and people have opened the door to that, you know, to the bank, at the UN, as Jelko told us. So the bank needs to use that seat in a credible fashion. And for the bank to do that, it's not enough to do the global monitoring report. We need to have real, credibility, analytical work-wise. Maybe the WDRs, maybe DEC should invest more in understanding, helping the bank understand what are the drivers of shared prosperity rather than having it as an edict. So I wanted to conclude here also by thanking our knowledge and communication team who helped us organize this event. They're really fantastic. And really thank you very much, Xavier, Daniel, if you're here. And I also wanted to recognize the presence of Pablo Van Silber, who is the manager who oversaw this evaluation. He's been very quiet, but he's really the architect behind a lot of the things that we've discussed today. So thank you very much.
Okay. And thanks. Before you all go, though, we want to hear from Manuela again, this time on the way forward.
I don't feel any. Actually, this report, complemented by this discussion, is a very good starting place for us to have a more informed but also more intelligent discussion around the topic. Carolina is right that when these goals were established, the idea was to focus the attention of management and staff around few objectives around which we would organize and prioritize our work. The original idea was to have one goal, and it was extreme poverty. And the addition of the second goal was really to recognize that if our fundamental mission is development, then being alive, which is what the first goal gives us, and having enough food to stay alive is not enough. That's not development, it's very reductionist. And so the objective was really to recognize and add a goal that would reflect the work that we do actually largely in middle-income countries, but it's actually also relevant for low-income countries. So that was a little bit the history. And it was never meant to be these are the only things we care about. And so the way Carolina described it, which is it's a conversation starter around which you analyze assets, drivers, returns, is in fact what these goals are meant to be. The same thing with the extreme poverty goal. Now, as a foundation to all of this is data. And it is also one of the key public goods that the bank conveys, pushes for at the country level, sometimes finances, and encourages others to also finance. And we've put a lot of effort on household surveys, but I think there are other data that are also very important. Labor force data, financial sector data with access. There's a set of basic data that is needed at the country level in order to inform country level policy, but also that we can help harmonize and convey as a public good. So this is very important, and we're very keen the SCDs continue to highlight those data gaps, and it's a basic service and value added that the SCD has brought in. I see a little bit of a confusion between the SCD and the CPF. CPF is essentially country driven. We cannot force the countries to ask us to fix their data gaps. So, and we want to maintain it that way. That architecture allows us to keep the SCDs as they are, as not driven by the country program. We don't want to ever encourage reverse engineering of SCDs so that they fit CPFs. So I think we're about in the right place. The question I wish that IEG had looked at is a little closer to what Shanta was asking about, which is what's broadly the impact? And in thinking about impact on shared prosperity, I don't think we should think about it at the project level. We need to think of it at the program level. I would even include IFC in MEGA in that goal, because if you invest in a particular area which is going to increase productivity, release some labor, and that labor moves to urban areas, and you have a different intervention there that creates jobs, maybe not for the bottom, but they absorb labor. At the program level, when you aggregate all these interventions, they may have the right impact. In fact, that's the question we should be asking, to have complementary actions, some of which we will finance or support and some of which others will, or the government with its own resources, right? So I think that sort of intermediate level and program level, I think is very important to consider. And so I'm of two minds on the, even though in my current hat, I do have guidance that tells all projects to articulate and make sure that each project is required to have that impact in the bottom 40 and the poverty impact. I do think that it's more relevant to actually think about that at the program level, at the more aggregate level. Another point that came up, and August couldn't miss the opportunity to highlight it, and it's also close to my heart, is analytics. So the introduction of the SCDs is a positive step. I think it really helped us, it really forced us to prioritize interventions and actions that at the country level would translate into a faster progress towards poverty reduction and shared prosperity. But what we've seen over time is that the analytical work of the bank has actually expanded considerably. But that expansion is largely driven by analytics that are funded out of trust funds and often earmarked for particular topics, which are not necessarily these topics. They're not necessarily integrated reports, or they're not really part of what we used to call the core diagnostics. We are in fact thinking about what that core set of diagnostics should be, and making sure that our own budget resources are sufficient to produce and offer countries sort of that minimum package of core analytics, which would inform SCDs and would inform others. In my mind, they're a public good as well. And they should be part of that boilerplate set of services that we offer to countries. And so we're actually working on that, and you may see something along those lines very soon. Last but not least, I want to acknowledge and encourage IFC's efforts. And one needs to realize that their financial model is quite different from that of the bank. And in some way, they do need to look at this portfolio approach in a much more deliberate way than we do. From the bank side, we have sovereigns on the other side and preferred creditor status. They don't. And so that requires that in trying to enhance their development impact, which is what 3.0 is trying to achieve, they also balance that out with affordability and ability to run a business, which IFC also has. But we are very committed, and I think there's a lot of potential for us to work more closely in trying to identify ex ante what are the types of investments and activities that could better combine these two objectives, your double bottom line. So let me wrap up. I know it's time to go back, but I really think this was a very interesting conversation, very, very fruitful, an excellent addition to the report, and I'm wondering if this is not a model that we should have more often in terms of even perhaps even before you conclude your reports, kind of taking into account the broader feedback of others. So congratulations, thank you very much. This will be very useful to staff in operations and in the bank. So thanks a lot and congratulations. Thank you to the panel. Thank you.